Welcome on back to History 1302. Here we go again. This is Professor Tatum to lead you through yet another lecture. Here we will be looking at our second half of the U.S. in World War II, examining here the four freedoms. As always, we'll be looking at a bit of context. Then we'll start looking at what World War II looked like on the home front, what was going on here in the U.S. Then we'll look at the U.S. Abroad. As usual, I'm not going to get too in detail about every little battle and campaign and different leaders and things like that. We're just going to kind of try to get a general overview of some of the bigger picture things that the U.S. was involved in abroad. And then we're going to look at how the war was brought to an end with a bang or two. And I do try to bring a little light to that because that is one of the most heavy, devastating, depressing, difficult topics that we will deal with throughout this entire semester. Heads up on that. Last point will get pretty heavy. There's your fair warning. So we need to remember that the U.S. first joined World War II after the bombing at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. I, of course, don't care that you know the date, but there it is if you want to know it. And once the U.S. joined World War II, they had aligned themselves with the Allied powers, right? So now we have the Allied powers, which were Great Britain, France, China, the Soviet Union, and the United States, facing off against the Axis powers, which were primarily comprised of Germany, Japan, and Italy. We do need to keep in mind there are several other nations aligned with one side or the other, providing various forms of support to either side, but these are the main players on either side here, okay? And when the U.S. got involved in World War II, President FDR suggested the U.S.'s goal in this war was to preserve four freedoms for people around the world. And you guys saw what these freedoms were by now. Hopefully, you're doing things in order. You'll see that these included things like the freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of speech, and freedom of worship. These four freedoms the U.S. is going to be working toward defending for all people around the world. So that shows us that the US has ambitions of becoming a big global leader after the war, right? If they're going to promise these things to all people of the world, then they're going to be playing a very significant role in making sure that those kinds of things happen. And we can notice that a lot of these are response to recent global conditions up to this point, right? Things like freedom from want, pretty direct response to people who wanted quite a bit and struggled quite a bit throughout the Great Depression, right? Who lived through a great deal of poverty throughout the Great Depression. Freedom from fear, freedom of speech, and freedom of worship. These are all responses to the dictatorships growing around the world that were doing things like cutting off free press, using expulsions and executions of political rivals to try to get people to comply with their leadership. Things like oppressive world leaders putting restrictions on religion, either saying you cannot worship this way or you must worship that way. All right. The U.S. is trying to say all these things we see happening around the world are not okay. They're all violations of these basic freedoms here that we believe all people around the world should have. But what I'd like us to consider as we move forward is how well do we see these four freedoms actually protected and actually put into place in different parts of the world that the U.S. is involved in. Okay. I'll break us down at certain points throughout the lecture to reflect on that. We just need to keep in mind talk is cheap. You can say all day you stand for one thing or another, but it's what you do with that that really actually matters at the end of the day. So, in examining World War II on the home front, we'll see a lot of similarities to things we saw during World War One. Okay, for example, the U.S. used a lot of similar tactics to gain public support for the war. For example, there was extensive state-sponsored propaganda. This was largely pushed from the Office of War Information, basically like the CPI was during World War One. The Office of War Information is for World War II. Okay, and again, if you go Googling that, just like with the CPI, you're going to find all kinds of random crap. I don't care that you know. What I want you to understand is that this is the office that was responsible for creating state sponsored propaganda. They did so through a variety of media, right? They had all kinds of posters, songs, etc., like we had seen before. But now they're also getting involved more into pop culture, all right? Incorporating this propaganda into things like Looney Tunes and Disney, all right? And some students, I guess this is just a very biased 21st century perspective on this. I don't know. But they suggest, well, wouldn't the government pushing all this propaganda just make people mad and make them less likely to support the war because they're mad at the government for pushing this propaganda on them? Guys, we are still getting fed propaganda nonstop, and we don't even realize it half the time. Because the thing about effective propaganda is you usually don't realize that it's propaganda. All right, it's subliminally pushing its messages onto you. So people aren't sitting here thinking, "Oh, I'm going to watch this propaganda." They're thinking, "I'm just watching Looney Tunes. I'm watching good old Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck here. If they're supporting the war, maybe I should too." So definitely a great deal of propaganda being spread here onto the public throughout World War II. Also, extensive use of the poster of Uncle Sam in this period, pointing his finger at you, telling you you better come join the U.S. Army. And I don't know that image of Uncle Sam pointing his finger. I should add to this slide, I guess. Um, I always find it so funny that from an American perspective, that just looks like a nice symbol because we're so used to seeing it, right? But I guarantee you, if somebody from another country, that looks kind of mean and imposing and kind of intimidating. This big old man just pointing his finger at you menacingly, saying, "I want you." It's a matter of perspective there. It shows how effective that propaganda has been, that it's become just a common symbol to us. The war was also funded through higher taxes as well as continued sale of Liberty bonds. Remember, Liberty bonds were those for certificates that could be purchased by Americans during the war and then cashed in at some point after the war. They'd get paid back with interest. But in the meantime, the money they were using to purchase those bonds was being used to fund the war. Again, like we saw with the CPI, the Office of War Information was extensively using propaganda to encourage people to purchase these Liberty bonds as well. Also, similar to World War One, we'd seen a great push for rationing, cutting back on certain types of food, certain types of raw materials, so that those could instead be sent to bases around the world to support the war effort. Something that was much more extensive in World War II than in World War One was the massive contribution of labor to the war effort. So this is what really brought an end to the Great Depression is industries around the country began shifting toward working toward war industries. Okay, so clothing companies in many cases, in addition to the normal clothes that they produced, also started creating, say, service uniforms for soldiers. Car companies would continue to produce their cars, but they would also begin manufacturing things like Jeeps and tanks to send abroad. And as these new products are being created by various industries, they have a new demand for workers to come and start working on producing these types of products. So this led to employment for millions of Americans, again, easing those pressures that had been faced throughout the Great Depression. And this also led to more employment opportunities for non traditional workers, such as women, elderly people, and minorities. Another way that the Great Depression was combated during World War II was through a program known as the Bracero Program. This was an agreement between the U.S. government and the Mexican government that allowed Mexican citizens to come work in the U.S. temporarily in order to, on one hand, stimulate the U.S. economy to help overcome the Great Depression, but also to pick and produce food to be sent to soldiers around the world as well, to help contribute to the war effort in that way. Now, this always just kind of goes over my head how the US is saying, "Hey, I know what we can do to help stimulate the economy. We can bring in people from Mexico." When just a few years before, they said, "Oh, there's too many people here from Mexico taking up all the jobs, and they're too expensive, and they're the cause of the Great Depression. So we need to ship them all off and send them out of the country." Remember that Mexican repatriation? Well, now a few years later, they're saying, "No, actually, we do need them here. They actually help the economy." I cannot even begin to explain the logic here, guys. Something else that was very helpful in combating the Great Depression was the passage of Executive Order 8802. So, this was a response to a planned march on Washington. And some civil rights leaders were pretty upset with the lack of employment opportunities in war industry jobs for minorities. And they were planning, as we can see here, this very large march on Washington. We're looking at tens of thousands of people here planning to come and meet at the nation's capital to demonstrate their frustration with the lack of opportunities that they were facing during the war. Now, they had other concerns as well, but this was kind of one of their key concerns. And then President FDR considered this, and he said, "Well, here I am on one hand, making these big, pretty speeches about how I'm protecting the four freedoms for people around the world. Yet, how's that going to look for me if I get the publicity of tens of thousands of people having to come and gather at the Capitol just to ask for fair economic opportunities. Does that really look like I'm actually providing the freedom from want, even within my own country, let alone around the rest of the world? All right, so he realized it would look really bad for him to have this march on Washington go through. He really did not want this to happen. So he sat down with some of the key leaders of this planned march on Washington and he made some negotiations with them. And he said, "We do not need to bring all these people to the Capitol. We can talk together and figure something out." Because he was really scared of what this march would mean for him. And what they agreed upon is what became Executive Order 8802. Ultimately, this executive order banned workplace discrimination in all war industry jobs. Okay. Please note that's just war industry jobs. So after the war, there's really no guarantee. But this is basically saying any company or industry that has any contribution toward war industry, and as we saw, all kinds of companies are getting involved in war industries at this point. They are not allowed to discriminate when it comes to hiring in terms of race. All right. So this led to, hey, that sounds historically significant, a big increase in work opportunities for minorities during the war. It also led to inspiration for post-war African American civil rights movements. All right, as we'll see, it's really after World War II that the African American civil rights movement and several other civil rights movements, for that matter, are going to really take off. And there's a lot of inspiration that they seem to have gotten here from the way Executive Order 8802 was passed. What they had here was they had a plan for this peaceful demonstration of just people coming and expressing their frustration by simply being present, maybe having some signs with some messages showing their frustration. But they didn't even have to carry through with this. They simply had to say, "We are going to come together and demonstrate our frustration." And that was enough to make some kind of reform on their behalf. All right. So they realized that this was an effective way to push for things like civil rights legislation. Okay. And this is a tactic that would commonly be used by the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s after World War II. Definitely a good step of progress here in terms of civil rights under Executive Order 8802. So as a result of Executive Order 8802, there was a heavy presence of African Americans in the workforce. And this contributed to a second Great Migration. Remember, we've seen the first Great Migration in the early 1900s, pretty much in response to Jim Crow, as African Americans were leaving the South. Kind of really boomed during World War I. Well, this is happening all again during World War II. As a result of Executive Order 8802, there's all kinds of opportunities for African Americans in cities in the North and in the West. So many of them began moving out of the South and settling in these other communities in other parts of the country. There was also a big increase of women in the workforce during World War II. Things like Executive Order 8802 helped employers realize that it's not the best idea to be so discriminatory against which workers you hire. And many employers did begin hiring more women into the workforce. A lot of this was also in response to the fact that as a lot of working class men were going off to war, there were more war vacancies that they couldn't be so picky about, so they kind of needed to take who they could get. And so what we saw as a result is more women working during World War II than there had been in any earlier point in U.S. history. This was heavily pushed as well through extensive propaganda, largely through the figure of Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter is, of course, this stock character you've probably seen in some form or fashion that's basically encouraging women to come join these war industry jobs. She is, on one hand, holding on to her traditional feminine characteristics. She has pretty makeup. She has this nice, neatly tied bandana on her head. But she also has that bandana there to keep sweat out of her face because she's working hard. And she has her sleeves rolled up. And she's clearly a very strong woman, showing we can do it, right? We can master both worlds. We can still be the great traditional, pretty feminine woman and enjoy our experience as a woman while also getting our hands dirty, going to work, and contributing to the war effort. So a lot of women use this situation to begin pushing for further uplift and equality. So what we'll see after the war is women were kind of expected to leave the workforce and go return to the homes. The nuclear family with the wife who cleans and cooks around the home. The man comes and works and comes home and dinner's ready for him or it's being cooked as he gets home to a nice clean home that the wife spent the day cleaning. Well, while that was the expectation, a lot of women found ways to stay within the workplace and said, no, we're earning something for ourselves here. And it's not like it was during the Great Depression where we're doing so as a mere matter of we're so desperate we have to. This is more women making the choice to come to the workplace. So definitely a big push as well toward women pushing for uplift and equality as a result of World War II. Another effort to address the Great Depression was the GI Bill, or the Servicemen Readjustment Act. The Great Depression during World War II was the GI Bill, also known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. So this is considering the conditions placed on veterans after World War One. So if we think, for example, of the Bonus Army, remember that was veterans who had to come and gather at the Capitol to try to desperately push for an early bonus payment because they were struggling so much. Then they got their asses kicked by the standing army. People did not want to see those kinds of conditions for veterans moving forward. So they said we need some kind of guarantees, some kind of bill of rights to help them out when they return from the war. So this helped provide things like vocational training, higher education, medical benefits, home loans, business loans, etc. for veterans. Now, please don't think that this meant that veterans have always, since moving forward, been treated excellently and had great conditions. There are all kinds of issues with the administrative offices that deal with these types of benefits. There is unfortunately since here been all kinds of promises made to veterans that are not honored. I'll just leave that at that. But this is at least making an effort to provide some kind of guarantees for servicemen. And even if any of these things are not honored and they're struggling to receive any of these things, they can turn back to this and say, look, I am supposed to have these things under this GI Bill. Something else we need to be aware of, however, is while there was great progress being made in terms of minority inclusion in war industry jobs as a result of Executive Order 8802, there was still a great deal of racial tension and discrimination, both within the service and just in mainstream American society. Several minorities realized, for example, that they really struggled to get the things that were promised to them under the GI Bill. And really, by World War II, some minority servicemen began to recognize a strange paradox. Right? You guys had read about an individual who noted this strange paradox, essentially saying that on one hand, he is fighting for things like freedom and democracy and spreading these four freedoms for people around the world. Yet, as an African American, he doesn't feel as if he's equally being provided those same types of freedoms that other Americans around him are due to his race. And this is something that has been prevalent in all conflicts up to this point in time, starting with the American Revolution. We need to understand that African Americans played key roles in helping the U.S. toward its war efforts. Yet they continuously would come home and face the same type of discrimination. In this particular case, we got Jim Crow laws in effect, right? And minority servicemen have also consistently faced discrimination within the service. This is particularly relevant during World War II, though, because a big part of the cause is not only spreading the four freedoms to people around the world, but one of the enemies that the U.S. was fighting during World War II was Nazi Germany. And they were, in theory, fighting against this idea of the Holocaust and creating a master race and fighting against this very racially motivated regime when there's still a great deal of that same type of racism prevalent both within the service and in U.S. society. So definitely still a good deal of racial tension throughout World War II. And as I suggested, minorities were frequently excluded from post-war benefits, things that were guaranteed, for example, under the GI Bill. A lot of minorities really struggled to get fair access to housing when it came to things like home loans. And this was a result of a practice known as redlining. So when a person would go to apply for a home loan, it would pretty much depend on the neighborhood that the home was in, whether or not they would receive that loan. And in neighborhoods where several minorities were settling, banks were less likely to give home loans. Okay. They would quite literally have maps of the city like this, and they would draw big red lines around certain districts, around certain neighborhoods where they knew that several minorities lived or were moving to, and those are basically marked as areas as if somebody wants to move in this area, we don't give them a loan, or if we are going to give them a loan, we charge them very high interest rates. Okay. And this made it far more difficult for minorities to become homeowners in the long term. That also made it more difficult for them to build generational wealth. You need to understand a home is kind of a foundation. It's something that individuals can either pass on to their children or that they can eventually sell and give that estate money to their children. And that helps them in turn become homeowners with that money they receive. It also kind of helps them learn the process of how to own and care for a home. And if none of that is happening here for this first generation of minorities, it's going to make it far more difficult moving further for future generations of minorities um, to be able to get access to homes. But I also want to look at a couple examples of racial tensions within the military. So we can look, for example, to Doris, or as he preferred to be called, Dory Miller. Dory Miller was a survivor of the attack on Pearl Harbor. During that attack, he manned a machine gun with no training and tried to gun down the Japanese planes that were bombing the base in order to protect his fellow servicemen. And that was very clearly an act of bravery, right? He said, I don't care if I don't have the training. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to do whatever it takes to defend the men around me. All right. I'm going to risk my life in the process. So he was awarded for his bravery with the Navy Cross, which is a pretty prestigious award. But he also received a promotion to third class cook. So basically, they're telling him, hey, thanks for your bravery. Now go get back to the kitchen, boy, and cook us something up. So several non minority war heroes had taken similar acts of bravery and had received much more prestigious promotions. Okay. It's pretty insulting that for putting himself at such risk and taking on such a task with no training, for Dory Miller to receive a promotion to being a high level cook. All right. This is a pretty clear example of discrimination against African Americans. Sure sounds historically significant, so you shouldn't have to make all kinds of random stuff up or find random things on the internet. It's all right here. He is an example of this bigger concept. There was also a great deal of discrimination toward Mexican American servicemen. So here we can look. We can look here, for example, to Macario Garcia. Macario Garcia was a war hero who was granted the Presidential Medal of Honor. And when he returned home here in Texas, he went to a restaurant and he was asked to leave the restaurant because they said, we don't serve Mexicans here. And Macario Garcia, rightfully so, was very offended. He said, look, I am a war hero. I have served my country. I am an American above all, and I think I have demonstrated that as clearly as I can. And I'm not leaving here. I have as much of a right to eat here as anyone else. It should not matter where my family is from, and that's not anything I should be ashamed of. I'm not leaving this restaurant. And when he refused to leave, he was arrested. So this here is a clear example of discrimination against Mexican Americans during World War II. All kinds of racial tensions and discrimination against servicemen here. But this wasn't exclusive to servicemen. Right? We can also see a clear example of discrimination against Mexican Americans through what was known as the Zoot Suit riots starting in LA. So this started with a subculture of individuals known as Pachucos. Pachucos, I always kind of like to think about in similar context to the greasers of the 1950s and 60s. If you've ever seen the movie Grease, or if you read or seen the movie The Outsiders, you know, there's this subculture of people. They all dress a certain way. They have their certain kind of style, their own kind of lingo. They like to listen to certain kinds of music. They hang out together, do things together. And some of them were involved in gangs, okay? Some of them kind of gang together and would get involved in criminal activities, getting fights and things together. But being a greaser didn't necessarily make an individual a gangster, right? That's just their kind of subculture. That's how they express themselves. Very similarly here, Pachucos had their own kind of subculture. These were primarily Mexican Americans who would dress very ostentatiously. They wear frequently big zoot suits with a lot of fabric, and they'd wear the big old pimp style hats with the feather. We call them pimp suits and pimp hats now, is kind of the title they'd gotten, but they were referred to as zoot suits in this period. But a lot of them didn't even dress that ostentatiously. A lot of them just wore maybe a nice shirt, some suspenders, a rounded hat. But there was this kind of stereotype that all these guys who dress like that hung together, they're all just these Mexican gangsters and they're nothing but trouble. And they were seen as unpatriotic as well. Because remember, people throughout the country during World War II were being encouraged to ration. They were being encouraged to cut back on certain foods and certain raw materials, including things like cloth. So here's these Pachuco's now wearing, in some cases, these zoot suits that have all this extra baggy fabric, and people see that as being very wasteful of the country's resources, while people are being expected to ration and cut back on those types of raw materials. Again, the Pachucos, from their perspective, are just expressing pride in themselves. They think they're cool, they're having a good time with the way they're dressing. But many people said, no, they're unpatriotic. So, with this mindset in mind of them being quote unquote unpatriotic for having this extra fabric on their clothes in some cases, there were some attacks throughout Los Angeles carried out against some of these Pachucos by some white Navy servicemen. So they would beat some of these Pachucos down, rip their clothing off of them, and just leave them laying there in the street, as we see pictured here. Then eventually, this went far beyond just some servicemen attacking Mexican American Pachucos, and it became more of an incident of mobs of white citizens storming minority neighborhoods, destroying Mexican American businesses, attacking Mexican Americans at random, and things really got out of hand. Okay. These Zoo Suit riots are absolutely an example of this discrimination against Mexican Americans, or overall, you could say, an example of these racial tensions that were very prevalent throughout World War II. Another thing we need to consider going on in the US during World War II were the internment of individuals under Executive Order 9066. So, you guys have learned a little bit about this by now. You've seen that this executive order called for the internment of primarily people of Japanese ancestry. There were some Germans and Italians who were also targeted and forced to go to these camps. But these individuals, with very short notice, pack up what they could carry with them, travel across the country to these camps, stay there, kind of be under the watch of the federal government. And the kind of justification for all of this is, well, we need to make sure that there's not spies among us from our enemy nations. But we're talking, there's elderly people, there's children. We're talking people of all ages, all different career backgrounds being forced into these camps. It's very difficult for me to imagine that somebody's little old grandma who works at a laundry is going to be some kind of saboteur for the Japanese government, or that somebody's 3-year-old child is gathering intel for the Japanese emperor. All right. But that was the justification used to force entire families of people to round up into these camps across the country. So, as suggested, there were some Germans and Italians put into these camps, but they were primarily people of Japanese ancestry. And some of these individuals put into these camps were what the Japanese people refer to as Aise, meaning Japanese nationals, okay, Japanese immigrants. But the majority were actually Japanese Americans, referred to as Naise. There are documentations of many loyal Americans in these camps, very conflicted about why they're being treated like prisoners or enemies when they identify more as Americans than they ever did as Japanese. We also got to keep in mind that several families of Japanese American servicemen who are out fighting against the Axis powers are now in the US being interned into these camps. I do want to stress that these are far different than, say, the Nazi concentration camps or the Soviet gulags. There was not mass execution, there wasn't starvation, things like that going on here. And some people use that to argue that this wasn't that bad. Okay, they had community centers where they could go socialize. But regardless, we need to consider what's going on here. We have people being cut off from society and placed to live together in this one area that's cut off from the rest of society. That's a prison. That's the best way I can think to understand this. That's exactly what it is. You're cutting individuals off from society. You're keeping them under close watch. You're giving them a strict set of regulations to follow within this place where they're cut off from society. That is the function of a prison. Only difference is prisons are made to house people who have been found by a court of law to be guilty of some form of some type of crime. The only crime these people here in many cases were guilty of was being of a particular ancestry. Okay. So I would say this is very clearly an example as well of racial or ethnic discrimination occurring during World War II. And we need to think about this. How do all these things we've looked at here going on in the US fit within this notion of the four freedoms? I can see where we can see them perhaps reflected with things like Executive Order 8802. That's providing more job opportunities for minorities, even if it is only short term. Also, there's employment opportunities being made more than ever for women. So, in both of those regards, we see that's kind of contributing to the freedom from want, providing more economic opportunities. Overall, there are just big booms in war industry jobs, again, creating freedom from want, perhaps. Yet we're also still seeing a great deal of discrimination, individuals facing violence, some individuals having a hard time getting loans for their homes. Then we see other individuals being rounded up and forced to go into camps. We see certain servicemen being treated differently than others due to their racial or ethnic backgrounds. How do all of these things fit within the four freedoms? I'll leave that for you to decide. All right, let's go ahead and move forward. All right, so now I want to look at what the US was doing in the European theater, meaning the part of the war that took place in Europe or mostly involving European powers. And we definitely also want to be examining where we do and perhaps do not see the four freedoms at play here in this part of the war. We need to understand that by the time the US entered this part of the war, the fighting had already greatly escalated. The Soviet Union had already done a great deal of damage to Nazi Germany and had also faced a great deal of losses as a result. We discussed that a little bit last lecture. So, the first major US campaign in the European theater actually didn't even start in Europe. It started in North Africa, which had been occupied by the Axis powers. So, the US helped the Allies invade North Africa, and take control of the region. And this also enabled them to take control of the Mediterranean. All right. Only reason I care we know about this at all is to understand that this is what enabled the US to invade Italy. All right? Remember, in Italy, Mussolini's in power. The US and the other Allied powers wanted to invade Italy so that they could topple Mussolini's regime. Once they took control of North Africa here and had control of the Mediterranean region, they were able to invade Italy through the little island here, Sicily, which is part of Italy, but it's separate from the mainland. Okay, so if you think of Italy as a boot, Sicily's the little rock here getting kicked by the boot. That's where they were going to invade to get into Italy to try to overthrow Mussolini. And a lot of this was largely made possible by a war that Mussolini had waged on the mafia. We need to understand that throughout southern Italy, especially in Sicily, the mafia was more than just a criminal organization. It was essentially a quasi system of government. So they would charge people in their communities taxes, in a sense. They would make them pay a sort of protection money. And in turn, they would act sort of as police, make sure that certain things did and did not happen. And they would provide various services to members of the community as well. Now, don't get me wrong, these were some very brutal bad guys, and they would do some very disturbing things. And we need to keep in mind the types of things they would do definitely denied people the four freedoms, let alone the basic freedom of life. All right. The Sicilian mafia, especially, was very brutal in terms of being willing to kill members of people's families, using car bombs, doing very, very disturbing things to get their point across and to get what they wanted. But Mussolini's problem with them was that they had so much influence in southern Italy. They're acting as essential governments in southern Italy. Remember, Mussolini was cracking down on any opposition throughout the country and was trying to completely consolidate his control over all of Italy. So he waged an all out war on the mafia to crack down on them. And as part of this war, he targeted not only suspected members of the mafia, but also their family members. All right. He would have them kidnapped and arrested. Sometimes this was to interrogate them, torture them, and question them. Other times it was just to hold them kind of as hostages to get certain mafiosi to come out of hiding. But this led to a great deal of resentment against Mussolini, not only in Italy, but also within a bunch of Italian American communities in the United States. And this great resentment growing in Italy, though, did cause a lot of Italians to flee Italy and come to the United States. So you'll see during Mussolini's years that he was in power, a big influx of Italian immigrants coming into the United States, especially from southern Italy. And a lot of that was just to generally escape the pressures of Mussolini, but a lot of it in particular was a response to his war on the mafia, where he was just rounding up suspected individuals and their family members to try to track down. So, in order to get access to Sicily so that they could carry out that invasion of Italy, the U.S. turned to this guy here for help, Charles Lucky Luciano. So he was the godfather of the Italian American mafia. So he essentially organized the mafia into what it is now in the United States, with the five New York families and other very well structured families around the country who have certain rules and regulations they have to abide by. Lucky Luciano also, we need to understand, had some contacts in the Italian mafia. So the U.S. had him reach out to his contacts over there in Sicily and have them help the US and the Allies get into Sicily, okay? Because the mafia kind of controlled all the docks into Sicily. They controlled all the access into Sicily. So Lucky Luciano reached out to them and said, "Hey, I need you to help these guys out, help them get into Italy." When they made this deal with him, he was in prison. And the deal was he would get a shorter prison sentence in exchange for helping the US get in contact with the people in Sicily who would help them with this invasion. They also provided the U.S. with all kinds of very valuable intelligence and just helped them along the way throughout their invasion of Italy. Once the Allies were able to invade Sicily with help from both the Italian American and Sicilian mafia here, they basically swept through Italy, got a lot of local support, largely because local mafia chieftains would go around telling people, you had better support the American effort here if you know what's good for you. And this essentially led to the beginning of the end of Mussolini. All right, so basically, I don't want to get too lost here. He got kicked out of power for a while, then he came back for a little bit, basically under this puppet government run by Nazi Germany, and then eventually he ended up getting executed. But long story short, once this invasion of Italy was carried out, he was weakened enough that his downfall was basically imminent at this point. All right, so the Allies had a pretty good victory here, taking this fascist regime out of Italy. We also need to look, though, at efforts taken by the US in terms of fighting Nazi Germany. So, the first major campaign against Nazi Germany was their invasion of Normandy, France. Remember, France had been occupied by Nazi Germany throughout World War II. And in this invasion, known as D Day, which is the largest amphibious invasion in world history, the US stormed the beaches of Normandy. They had guys coming here in ships, they also had planes flying overhead. And this was a very, very costly battle. A lot of the Allied powers were killed as they stormed up onto these beaches. But this was also a very substantial victory. Meanwhile, their allies in the Soviet Union were pushing into Germany and German territory from the east. So now Nazi Germany was getting pressured from both sides. The Soviets had been pushing for quite some time, and now with the support of the US, Britain and France were able to start putting more support from the other side here. And basically, Germany knew they were screwed, and it was just a matter of time before their plan was going to all fall apart. So Hitler kind of started in his pants when he saw this happening. He said, "Our downfall is imminent. Not a lot I can do here. I'm going to go out with style." And he ended up committing suicide with his wife of one day. How romantic, I know, Romeo and Juliet. They got down in this bunker, they killed themselves, and shortly after Hitler's suicide, the Nazi Party kind of realized, okay, the game's up. Hitler's gone. What are we doing here? We're all screwed. And Germany surrendered shortly after Hitler's suicide here. And after Germany surrendered and the Allies started occupying all of the former Nazi territory, is when the Allies really started realizing the full extent of the Holocaust. Okay, finding death camps, for example, that could kill over 1,000 people at a time. The gas chamber in Auschwitz, for example, could kill up to 12,000 people. All right, I want to remind us this was no secret. People knew these kinds of things were going on, but not to this extent. Okay, and I do need us to know that shortly before Germany is surrendered, President FDR died while still in office. The reason I want us to understand that is because his vice president, Harry Truman, who succeeded him as president, would see the US throughout the rest of the World War, and he aimed to uphold those four freedoms. Okay, so I just want us to understand, yes, President FDR died during this war before Germany surrendered, but Truman's going to carry through with his vision of the four freedoms. And on that note, let's consider how well we've seen the four freedoms carried out here in the European theater. Well, on one hand, the US has helped topple these very oppressive regimes under people like Hitler and Mussolini, who are very much denying people the four freedoms, but also who are they cooperating with in order to make this happen? They're receiving help from both the Sicilian and the Italian American mafias, who are very violent organizations engaged in things like uh, drug trafficking and human trafficking and prostitution, murder, extensive theft. All of these things we can see deny people things like that freedom from fear and freedom from want, right? Furthermore, we got to remember that one of the Allied powers is the Soviet Union under people like Joseph Stalin, who were committing atrocities against their own people and very much denying people these four freedoms as well. So we can see perhaps there's a bit of compromise here. On one hand, sure, by toppling these regimes, you're helping people gain some of those four freedoms, but you're also cooperating with and empowering in many ways individuals who also bring those four freedoms into question. One final part of the war we need to look at is the Pacific Theater. So this is the war, as the name suggests, fought in the South Pacific against the Japanese Empire. So we need to understand that the US's conflict here in the South Pacific against the Japanese had begun before they even got involved in the European theater. Remember, the US first entered this war as a result of Japan bombing Pearl Harbor. And we need to understand that in this portion of the war, the Americans were the primary fighting force for the Allied powers. And the European theater, they were just kind of backing everybody up. Here, they were the main force, getting a little support here and there, especially from China. But for the most part, they were on their own. These battles fought in the Pacific consisted of what was referred to as island hopping, where the U.S. would go and occupy one island out in the Pacific and then take over it, and then they'd make their way to a nearby island, fight some battles there, take over again. And they're just trying to get closer and closer and closer to Japan, taking over one island at a time, basically as stepping stones to make their way to mainland Japan. These were very costly battles, and the U.S. lost a lot of troops along the way. This was largely due to this kind of ancient code of honor that several individuals in the Japanese military had that were rooted in samurai tradition. Many of them were willing to die before dishonoring their nation or their empire by allowing their enemies to have any kind of victory. So, bringing down their enemies in some cases for some of these individuals was more important than protecting their own lives. They were more concerned with protecting their nation and their honor than their own lives. Clear example of that we can see are Japanese kamikaze pilots. These were Japanese fighter planes that would intentionally go on suicide missions and blow themselves up and take other American planes down with them. Okay, very clearly showing they're more concerned with taking down the enemy honorably and keeping them from getting too close to their fellow men over here than they are with preserving their own lives. And as the US started having some victories with these island hopping campaigns, there was a big question on the table of whether or not to invade Japan. There's been very much history written in one direction on this that makes it seem as if it was inevitable that the US found an alternative solution to invading Japan. I may be the first to tell you, but it is what it is. That's a load of malarkey. Okay. There was a huge debate on whether or not the US should invade Japan. Some military experts were looking at the evidence on hand, and they were saying, "Look, Japan's already been severely weakened, not only from our island hopping campaigns, but also from some fighting that they've had with the Soviet Union. They are severely weakened by this point. With a little support from the Allies, especially from the Soviet Union, we could very easily invade them with minimal casualties and force them to surrender." Now, others were suggesting, no, this is going to be a very dangerous invasion. We see that these guys are more concerned with honor than their own lives in many cases. This could be very costly. And somehow they estimated, I don't know where they pulled this number from, but this could cost somewhere up to 1 million American lives. The second argument has kind of been the dominant argument in this debate here that's gotten carried across in history. This first argument here, made by several military experts of the time, has been largely forgotten. So when historians go and try to revisit the records left behind that suggest this, people say, oh, we're just changing our history. No, this was prevalent in the period here. But this argument of an invasion was made pretty moot with the success of a clandestine government project known as the Manhattan Project. So this was a federally funded project who operated in secret in towns like Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And they were working on creating atomic weapons. The reason they started this project is because there's evidence to suggest that Nazi Germany had been already creating atomic weaponry. So the original intention of these was to either counter or be used against Nazi Germany. Hold that thought. And by summer of 1945, the war was already over in Europe, but the US was still fighting in Japan. And by this time, the Manhattan Project had kind of made some success, and they had finished an atomic bomb that they wanted to test out. They figured this was a good time because by testing it out, they could kind of scare the out of the Japanese. So during this period, they decided to test out the first atomic bomb in human history. All right, let's take a look at how this impacted some of the individuals who were present as this bomb was tested.
Manhattan Project scientists William Spindell, Roger Rasmussen, Lily Hornig, and Val Fitch remember witnessing the Trinity test, including the vibrant colors and the force of the shock wave.
I was about 20 miles away from the site, and we were supposed to keep our eyes closed for the first 10 seconds because of ultraviolet radiations. And then we were told that was okay, we could watch. I estimated that at 20 miles away, the explosion would travel at the speed of sound, would take about a minute to reach me. And it was the most, not frightening, but intimidating minute I've ever spent. Seeing this terrible ball growing and growing, enormous colors, and what was the blast going to be when it finally got to me a minute later. And hugging the ground, fear. And fortunately, obviously, it wasn't that great because I'm still here.
The brightest light I'd ever observed with my eyes closed that I'd ever seen. That was the detonation. But no noise and no sound and nothing to see until our troop master said we could look up. The lightning had passed by then, but there was this beautiful color of the bomb. Gorgeous.
Thing loomed in front of us. Boiling clouds and color, vivid colors like violet, purple, orange, yellow, red, just everything. It was fantastic. And we were all kind of shaken up.
That's the most surprising thing of all, the fantastic flash of light. And then, of course, you see the dust cloud and the ball slowly rising off the ground, and the famous mushroom cloud eventually. So I got up off the ground to get a better view of that, and totally forgetting that the shock wave had yet to arrive. It might take only 30 microseconds for the light to arrive, but it takes about 30 seconds for the shock wave. Well, it's hard to overstate the impact on the senses. They're just, words haven't been invented to describe it.
So we can see that this was clearly a tremendous scientific feat. The scientists were clearly mesmerized by what they had created. But you could also tell by their language that they knew that they had created something that would be more destructive than humanity had ever seen. Again, guys, I'm giving you a heads up that what we'll be looking at moving forward is very difficult and should be taken very seriously. Okay. So President Truman was informed that the bomb was ready for use, and he gave Japan an ultimatum. He told them to surrender by a certain date, and he said if they did not surrender by that date, they would face utter devastation. And I'd like to think that Japan kind of underestimated what exactly he meant, what the exact magnitude of the U.S. had in mind would be. Otherwise, I don't see that they would not surrender here. But Japan refused to surrender. They upheld their honor. And in response, the U.S. dropped this hunk of metal here, known as Little Boy, in the town of Hiroshima, Japan, on August 6, 1945. This hunk of metal killed about 80,000 people instantly, majority of whom were civilians. Several thousand more would die moving forward from burns and radiation poisoning. They're dropping this devastating bomb that took so many lives and completely annihilated the city of Hiroshima. Truman got onto public television and he laid it out to Japan that he would wage more destruction on them than they had ever began to imagine in their lifetimes if they did not surrender. Japan was a little occupied right after this bombing with trying to recover from what had just happened. Okay. This is more destruction in one moment, in one day, than the human race had ever seen. Okay. And they're trying to make sense of what just happened, trying to figure out how to regroup and recuperate. And within the span of 3 days following this very unprecedented, devastating attack, members of the Japanese government never came out and publicly said, okay, we surrender, because they were too occupied trying to recover and survive. And because they never came out and publicly said, we surrender, 3 days later, the US dropped another atomic bomb named Fat Man on the town of Nagasaki, Japan. This bomb was just as destructive as the one dropped on Hiroshima. And at this point, Japan was so devastated after having 2 cities completely cleared out and tens of thousands of citizens killed, the majority of whom were civilians. They came out and said, please, no more. We surrender. Just look at the devastation caused by these bombs. These cities were completely cleared out. There were parents without children, children without parents, brothers without sisters, husbands without wives, and vice versa. People losing their pets, pets looking for their deceased owners. There are no buildings, even the trees, the grass, it's all destroyed. And since this has happened, there have been a lot of explanations for why the US government sanctioned such a devastating, unprecedented attack on another society of human beings. Now, the kind of popular narrative that's come out of this is that it was necessary to avoid the invasion and the loss of American lives. This is rooted in those who argued that, oh, yeah, an invasion would have been too costly, it would have costed somewhere around 1 million American lives. But remember, the problem with this theory, the state of Japan was already greatly weakened by this point in the war, and there were several military experts suggesting that with support from some of the other allied powers, an invasion could have been very practical, and Japan could have been pressured into surrender without too much loss. I would just like to think that that could have been examined a little further before going through with such devastating actions here. And I do want to point out, while this is the most common explanation, that doesn't mean it's the only one, right? This is an easy way of understanding, oh, this was just inevitable. We had to do this. Remember, there were counter arguments. There was evidence to the contrary that could have been considered. Another prominent explanation suggested that these bombings were based in some kind of racial or cultural discrimination against the Japanese. But this just doesn't really add up. Problem with this theory we need to consider is, what were the original plans for the atomic bombs being created by the Manhattan Project? Remember, they were creating atomic weapons in response to Nazi Germany having atomic weapons. Okay. And Nazi Germany is kind of the epitome of a white supremacist regime based on racial and cultural discrimination against people of other ethnicities and other colors. So if the bomb was originally planned to be used against them, that really kind of complicates this whole notion of this being all racial, culturally motivated. But that is a prominent explanation that's been suggested by some scholars. Another explanation is this is the first demonstration, or as I say, the first flex of the coming Cold War. This seems to add up. The Cold War, as we'll see moving forward, is a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to dominate global politics and global thought, essentially for the several decades following World War II. Those two nations will emerge from this war as the only two real superpowers, the only two nations with any real clout, and they're going to compete globally to spread their influence. And this is perhaps the US taking the first step, seeing that kind of coming, and showing the Soviet Union that they mean business. And this seems to add up, right? So we need to consider if the US was going to go through the invasion, they would have had to depend on the Soviet Union for support. This is showing the Soviet Union, we don't need your support for an invasion. We're very capable of destroying cities on our own. We can force Japan to surrender without your help. This is also sending a message to the Soviet Union that if after the war you decide you're going to come challenge us, this could be you and your kids next. It could be your child there sitting in all this rubble looking for his parents. And if you don't want that, you better play by our rules after the war. To me, this is the most reasonable explanation. That is my historical interpretation based on how I understand the evidence. Yours may be a little different. That's okay. That's the study of history. Again, I know this is a very heavy topic. Every time I cover this, I get chills, I get emotions, and it's just a lot to think about. But it's very much a reality of our past that we do need to grapple with. All right, we need to wrap up by examining the four freedoms in the Pacific Theater. We need to remember what the Japanese regime was doing in the years leading up to and during World War II. Remember, they were very much denying people some of these four freedoms, doing things like denying freedom of the press, carrying out very brutal invasions that involved killing contests of civilians, sexual assaults on civilians. The Japanese emperor and military were also responsible for all kinds of executions of political rivals. So this is a pretty brutal regime that in very many ways is denying people the four freedoms. So by fighting against that regime, in a sense, the US perhaps is helping defend the four freedoms for the people of Japan. However, we also need to consider the decision to annihilate two Japanese cities to an unprecedented level that really no man-made destruction since has replicated. How does that fit within the four freedoms? Destroying cities, destroying food sources, killing civilians, leaving people orphaned and without spouses and family members and friends. How does that protect, say, from the freedom from fear or the freedom from want? I'll leave that for you guys to decide. That's where we're going to wrap up this lecture. Please let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, that's it for now. Over and out.